Here's a question that's been bugging archaeologists for decades. What if everything you learned about the beginning of civilization is wrong? Not a little wrong. Completely, fundamentally turn the textbook upside down wrong. What if the story didn't start where we think it did? What if what we call the beginning is actually just the middle, or maybe even the end of something much older, much stranger, and way more sophisticated than we ever imagined? Right now, if you crack open any history textbook, you'll find the same story. Civilization began in Mesopotamia around 3500 BC. The Sumerians built the first cities, invented writing, created complex governments, and basically kicked off everything we recognize as civilized life. Before that, just nomadic hunter-gatherers wandering around, living hand-to-mouth, leaving nothing behind but stone tools and cave paintings. That's the narrative. That's what we've been teaching for generations. Sumer is the cradle. Everything before is prehistory. End of story. Except it's not the end of the story. Not even close. Because here's what they don't tell you in those textbooks. In the past few decades, archaeologists have been finding things that shouldn't exist. Structures that shouldn't be there. Evidence of organization, planning, and sophistication that predates the Sumerians by thousands of years. Not hundreds. Thousands. We're talking about monumental architecture from 9600 BC, stone circles arranged with astronomical precision from 12,000 years ago, complex settlements and meeting places that existed when, according to the old narrative, humans were supposed to be scattered bands of survivors just barely scraping by after the last ice age. And these aren't fringe discoveries by conspiracy theorists with metal detectors and YouTube channels. These are peer-reviewed, carbon-dated, published in Nature kind of discoveries by serious archaeologists who are just as shocked as anyone else. Sites that have forced the scientific community to quietly, uncomfortably start asking questions they thought were already answered. How did people with supposedly primitive technology move stones weighing 10 tons or more? Why would hunter-gatherers who were supposedly struggling just to eat dedicate decades, maybe generations, to building massive stone temples? What kind of social organization does that require? What kind of knowledge? And most importantly, what else did they build that we haven't found yet? Or that we can't find anymore because it's buried under 400 feet of ocean water from when the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, drowning coastlines where millions of Ice Age humans actually lived? See, we've been looking for civilization in all the wrong places. We've been digging in deserts and river valleys, finding the stone and clay that survived. But what about the coasts? What about the river deltas and fertile plains that are now underwater? What stories are sitting on the ocean floor, silent and unreachable, because we assumed nothing important happened before Sumer? The Sumerian narrative is clean, it's simple. It fits on a timeline, but reality is messier than that. And the more we dig, literally and figuratively, the messier it gets. Every new discovery pushes the boundaries back further. Every carbon date that comes back older than expected creates more questions than answers. So here's the real question, the one that should keep you up at night. How old is human civilization really? Not cities, not writing, not empires, but civilization, organization, intentionality, the capacity to dream something massive and then build it. Because if that didn't start in Sumer, if it started thousands of years earlier in places we've barely begun to explore, then we're not just missing a few pages of human history. We're missing entire chapters, maybe entire volumes, and we're about to go looking for them. Before we can ask how old civilization really is, we need to get brutally honest about something. What the hell do we actually mean when we say civilization? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. For the past 150 years, archaeologists have been using a definition that was basically designed to make one particular part of the world look like the cradle of everything important. And that definition has shaped what we look for, what we notice, and what we dismiss as primitive or irrelevant. The traditional checklist goes like this. A civilization needs writing. It needs cities, permanent settlements with thousands of people living together. It needs monumental architecture, big impressive structures that require organized labor. It needs social hierarchy, kings and priests and peasants, everyone knowing their place. And ideally, it needs to be in Mesopotamia or Egypt or maybe China if we're being generous. Anywhere else? Sorry, that's just a complex society, not a real civilization. This isn't just academic nitpicking. This definition has real consequences. When archaeologists find sophisticated astronomical alignments in the Americas, they get categorized differently than when they find them in the Near East. When they discover evidence of long-distance trade networks in Ice Age Europe, it doesn't count the same way as trade networks in Bronze Age Anatolia. The definition determines what gets funded, what gets studied, what ends up in textbooks as civilization versus what gets relegated to footnotes as interesting but ultimately primitive. And here's the thing, nobody sat down and consciously decided to create a biased definition. It happened gradually, naturally, as European archaeologists in the 1000s and 1800s studied the places they could reach most easily. The Middle East, the Mediterranean, parts of North Africa. They found cities and writing and temples, and they said, aha, this is what civilization looks like. Then they went everywhere else and measured everything against that standard. Doesn't look like Sumer, not civilized. Simple as that. But what if we built our definition differently? What if instead of starting with cities and writing, we started with evidence of complex abstract thinking? The ability to conceive of and execute long-term projects that wouldn't pay off for years or generations. The capacity to organize large groups of people toward a common goal without necessarily having a king with a palace and a bureaucracy with tablets. The sophistication to observe celestial patterns and encode that knowledge in monuments and myths. By the way, I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment. I love seeing how far these questions about our past can travel. Here's what happens when you shift the framework. Suddenly things start looking very different. Take Göbekli Tepe, which we'll dive deep into later. No city, no writing, no palaces. But somehow, people organize the labor to quarry, transport, and erect stones, weighing up to 16 tons, then carved them with sophisticated symbolic imagery, then built the whole thing specifically to be buried and preserved. That took planning, organization, shared belief systems, probably specialized knowledge kept by a priestly class. Is that not civilization just because nobody wrote it down? Or consider the archaeological evidence for long-distance trade in the Upper Paleolithic, 30,000 years ago. Seashells from the Mediterranean showing up 400 miles inland. Obsidian from volcanic sources being found hundreds of miles away, at sites where it had been worked into tools. Amber from the Baltic appearing in southern Europe. This wasn't random wandering. This was systematic exchange, trade networks that had to be maintained across generations, probably with social rules about who could trade what with whom. That requires social complexity, trust networks, probably kinship systems that connected distant groups. Why doesn't that count? Or think about astronomical knowledge. We know from stone circles and carefully aligned monuments that people were tracking solstices, equinoxes, maybe even precession, thousands of years before anyone invented writing. That knowledge had to be discovered through systematic observation over many generations, then encoded in ways that would preserve it, then transmitted to successors who could interpret and maintain it. That's institutional knowledge. That's exactly what writing eventually lets civilizations do, just using different technology. The traditional definition privileges certain technologies, writing, metallurgy, irrigation agriculture, over others. But what about the technology of building in wood rather than stone, which would leave almost no archaeological trace? What about sophisticated boat building that let people navigate open ocean thousands of years before the Bronze Age? What about the social technology of maintaining cooperation and knowledge sharing across scattered populations without written codes or standing armies? We're starting to realize that our definition has been too narrow, too focused on the specific path that led to the civilizations we know best. Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley. Those places developed in particular environmental contexts, with particular challenges and opportunities. They needed writing because they developed complex economies that required record keeping. They needed cities because irrigation agriculture created concentrated food surpluses in river valleys. They needed monumental architecture partly to demonstrate power in flat landscapes where everyone could see everything. But other environments might produce equally sophisticated societies that solve problems differently. Mobile populations that never build permanent settlements but maintain complex social networks across vast territories. Societies that encode knowledge in oral traditions and physical landscapes rather than written tablets. Cultures that organize around shared ritual and cosmology rather than centralized political authority. When we broaden the definition, we're not trying to be inclusive for its own sake. We're trying to recognize that civilization, at its core, is about humans transcending immediate survival, needs to create something larger. Shared meaning, accumulated knowledge, coordination at scales beyond the family band. The specific form that takes, cities or stone circles, ziggurats or astronomical alignments, might vary wildly depending on environment and circumstance. This matters because it changes what we look for in the deep past. If we're only looking for proto-cities and early writing, we'll miss evidence of complex societies that organize differently. If we assume civilization requires agriculture and permanent settlement, we'll dismiss sophisticated Ice Age cultures as mere hunter-gatherers. If we think monumental architecture has to mean temples and palaces, we might overlook monuments built for entirely different purposes. So when we ask how old is civilization really, we're not just asking about dates. We're asking what we're willing to recognize as civilization in the first place. And once we open up that definition, once we start looking for complexity and sophistication in forms we hadn't considered, the timeline starts stretching back much, much further than Sumer. Back past the agricultural revolution, back into the Ice Age itself, back to a world we're only beginning to understand. Let's talk about Sumer. For most of the 20th century, if you asked an archaeologist when civilization began, they'd point you straight to southern Mesopotamia, to the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, somewhere around 4,500 to 4,000 BC. This was the benchmark, the measuring stick, the starting line of human civilization. And on the surface, it makes perfect sense. The Sumerians gave us cities, real cities, not just villages that got too big for their own good. Places like Uruk, which by 3,200 BC had maybe 40,000 people living within its walls. That's not a settlement. That's an urban center with all the problems and innovations that come with cramming that many humans into one place. They gave us writing. Cuneiform, those wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay tablets. The earliest examples date to around 3,400 BC, starting as basic accounting records, tally marks for grain and livestock. But within a few centuries, they're writing down laws, recording history, composing poetry. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, comes from Sumer. A tale about a king searching for immortality, wrestling with what it means to be human, asking the same existential questions we're still asking today. They gave us monumental architecture, ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids that dominated the Sumerian skyline. The White Temple at Uruk sat atop a ziggurat 40 feet high, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. These weren't just buildings, they were statements, declarations that humans could reshape the earth itself, pile stone upon stone until they touched the realm of the gods. They gave us bureaucracy, which sounds boring until you realize what it actually means. Specialized professions, professional administrators, scribes, priests, accountants. Division of labor at a scale never seen before. Some people farming, others making pottery, others keeping records, all coordinating their efforts through increasingly complex social hierarchies. They gave us mathematics. The base 60 number system the Sumerians developed is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. They calculated the area of fields, tracked the movements of planets, developed geometrical concepts that wouldn't be formalized in the West for thousands of years. So yeah, calling Sumer the first civilization seems reasonable. This is where all the pieces come together for the first time in a way archaeologists can definitively document. Cities, writing, monumental architecture, specialized labor, mathematics, organized religion, centralized government. Check every box on the civilization checklist and Sumer lights up. That's why it became the default starting point. That's why your history textbook probably had a chapter titled something like The Dawn of Civilization, Ancient Mesopotamia. The evidence was clear, abundant, and impressive. Case closed. Except here's the thing that should bother you. It's the same thing that bothered some archaeologists, even back when Sumer was first being excavated in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The sophistication appears too suddenly. Not gradually, not with the stumbling experimentation you'd expect from people figuring everything out for the first time, but with a level of refinement that suggests these technologies and social systems had already been developing somewhere, somehow, for a very long time before they show up in the Sumerian archaeological record. Take the writing. Yes, the earliest examples we have are simple accounting marks, but within just a few hundred years, we're seeing complex literary compositions, legal codes, administrative documents that assume a shared understanding of abstract concepts. That's not what invention looks like. That's what maturity looks like. Or consider urban planning. Uruk didn't just happen. Its layout shows sophisticated understanding of drainage, defensive architecture, and social organization. The temples aren't randomly placed. The residential districts aren't haphazard. Somebody knew what they were doing. Somebody had done this before, or at least had access to knowledge from people who had. The mathematics is even more revealing. Mathematical systems don't spring fully formed from someone's forehead. They develop gradually, through generations of trial and error, practical application, refinement. But Sumerian mathematics appears in the archaeological record, already systematic, already sophisticated. They're using it to solve complex engineering problems, calculate areas and volumes, track astronomical cycles. Where are the primitive beginnings? Where are the mistakes, the false starts, the gradual refinements? And then there's agriculture. The Sumerians were farming at a level of sophistication that required deep understanding of irrigation, soil management, crop rotation, selective breeding. These aren't skills you develop in a generation or two. These are skills that accumulate over thousands of years of patient observation and experimentation. So where did the Sumerians learn them? The standard answer is that they developed these technologies gradually in the preceding millennia, in smaller settlements that left less archaeological evidence. And that's probably partially true. We do have evidence of earlier villages in the region, agricultural communities dating back to 6000 or 7000 BC. But there's still a gap between small farming village and sophisticated urban civilization that feels too large, too sudden. It's like finding a teenager who can barely drive suddenly piloting a commercial airliner. Sure, they're both operating vehicles, but the complexity gap is enormous. Where's the training period? Where's the learning curve? Some archaeologists noticed this problem early on. They asked the uncomfortable question, what if Sumer wasn't inventing these things? What if Sumer was inheriting them? What if somewhere else, earlier, there had been development of sophisticated social technologies, agricultural systems, perhaps even early forms of record-keeping and monumental construction, and that knowledge had somehow been passed down, transmitted, preserved through some mechanism we haven't fully understood? That's a dangerous question in archaeology. It opens doors to all kinds of speculation, some of it productive, some of it less so. It invites theories about lost civilizations, ancient advanced cultures, all the stuff that makes mainstream archaeologists nervous, because it can slide very quickly into pseudoscientific nonsense. But it's still a legitimate question, because the pattern we see with Sumer, this sudden flowering of sophisticated civilization, it's not unique. We see similar patterns elsewhere. The Egyptian civilization appears in the archaeological record, already surprisingly developed. The Indus Valley civilization emerges with sophisticated urban planning already in place. The early Chinese dynasties show advanced bronze-working techniques that seem to have appeared rather suddenly. Every time there's this nagging sense that we're missing something, that we're seeing the final product, not the development process. That somewhere, somehow, humans had been working on these problems longer than the archaeological record currently shows. Now, maybe that's just the nature of archaeology. Maybe the earliest experiments were done in materials that don't preserve well, or in locations we haven't excavated yet, or in contexts that are now underwater, buried, or destroyed. That's entirely possible, probable even. But what if it's something else? What if Sumer was the inheritor of knowledge that had been accumulating not for a few thousand years, but for much longer? What if the first civilization was actually remembering, reassembling, reconstructing something that had been known before? That's the question we need to ask. Because if it's true, if there's any truth to it at all, then everything we think we know about the timeline of human civilization needs to be reconsidered. And as it turns out, there's evidence. Real, physical, datable evidence that humans were doing remarkable things thousands of years before Sumer. We just need to look in places the mainstream wasn't looking for a very long time. Places like a rocky hilltop in southeastern Turkey, where something impossible was waiting to be discovered. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists thought they had the story figured out. Humans were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Then, around 10,000 BC, they invented agriculture. Farming created food surpluses. Surpluses allowed people to settle down. Settlements grew into villages. Villages needed organization. Organization required religion and leadership. And from all of that, eventually, you got civilization. Temples, cities, writing, in that order. Agriculture first, then everything else. It was a clean narrative, linear, logical. Almost everyone believed it. Then in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt showed up at a rocky hilltop in southeastern Turkey, looked at what local shepherds had been ignoring for generations, and realized that everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization was wrong. The site was called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, that means Potbelly Hill. Not exactly an inspiring name for what would become the most important archaeological discovery of the last 100 years. But Schmidt wasn't interested in names. He was interested in the massive stone fragments jutting out of the ground, fragments that didn't look natural, didn't look random. They looked carved, shaped, intentional. He started digging, and what he found defied everything. Göbekli Tepe wasn't a settlement. There were no houses, no cooking hearths, no trash pits full of broken pottery and food waste. Instead, Schmidt uncovered massive stone circles, rings of carved pillars standing upright, some over 15 feet tall and weighing more than 10 tons each. The pillars were T-shaped, precisely cut from limestone bedrock, then transported to the site and erected in careful arrangements. But it wasn't just their size that was shocking, it was what was on them. The pillars were covered in carvings, detailed, sophisticated reliefs of animals. Not just simple scratches or stick figures. These were recognizable, anatomically accurate depictions. Foxes, boars, lions, gazelles, snakes, scorpions, vultures. Some pillars showed groups of animals in dynamic poses, predators hunting, birds in flight. Others displayed abstract symbols, geometric patterns that might have represented constellations or spiritual concepts we can't even guess at. And then Schmidt got the radiocarbon dates back. 9,600 BC. Some sections possibly even older. Others continuing until around 8,000 BC. Let that sink in for a moment. Göbekli Tepe was built around 11,600 years ago. That's more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge, more than 6,500 years before the Egyptian pyramids, more than 6,000 years before the Sumerian city-states that we've been calling the cradle of civilization. But here's what really shattered the old narrative. When Göbekli Tepe was being built, agriculture didn't exist yet, not in that region, not anywhere nearby. The people who carved these pillars and erected these stone circles weren't farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, full-time, nomadic, supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers who, according to everything we thought we knew, shouldn't have been capable of creating anything like this. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous. There's no sign of domesticated plants or animals at Göbekli Tepe during its main period of use. The people who built it were hunting wild game and gathering wild plants, Just like their ancestors had done for tens of thousands of years, they hadn't settled down. They hadn't created permanent villages. They were still mobile, still moving with the seasons. And yet somehow they organized themselves to quarry multi-ton stone blocks from bedrock, carve them into precise shapes, transport them significant distances, and erect them into circular arrangements that required sophisticated engineering knowledge. They created art that demonstrates careful observation of the natural world and possibly abstract symbolic thinking. They built structures that would have required hundreds, maybe thousands of people working together over extended periods. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The old model said you needed agriculture to create food surpluses. You needed surpluses to free up labor for non-food producing activities. You needed settled populations to organize large-scale construction projects. You needed all of that before you could build monuments or develop religion complex enough to require ceremonial architecture. Göbekli Tepe flipped that entire sequence on its head. Schmidt realized he was looking at something revolutionary. These hunter-gatherers had built the monuments first. They had developed organized religion, shared belief systems, and social hierarchies complex enough to mobilize massive labor forces, all before they had farms, before they had permanent settlements, before they had any of the things we thought were prerequisites for civilization. In fact, Schmidt began to argue something even more radical. Maybe the monuments caused agriculture. Maybe the need to support the workers building and maintaining places like Göbekli Tepe created pressure to develop more intensive food production methods. Maybe religion didn't emerge from agriculture. Maybe agriculture emerged from religion. The evidence at the site supports this wild idea. As excavations continued, archaeologists found that the region around Göbekli Tepe is where some of the world's first domesticated grains originated. Genetic analysis shows that ancient varieties of cultivated wheat and barley developed within a few hundred miles of the site, at exactly the same time period when Göbekli Tepe was in use. Coincidence? Maybe. But it's starting to look like the seasonal gatherings at Göbekli Tepe, where different hunter-gatherer groups came together for ceremonies and celebrations, created exactly the conditions that would favor experimentation with plant cultivation. Large groups gathering regularly in the same location would deplete wild resources quickly. They'd need to find ways to increase food availability. They'd notice which plants grew back fastest. They'd start protecting and eventually cultivating the most productive varieties. Religion didn't follow agriculture. Agriculture followed religion. But Göbekli Tepe raises as many questions as it answers. Maybe more. Why did they build it? The site clearly wasn't residential. No one lived there full time. Was it a temple? A gathering place for seasonal festivals? An astronomical observatory? Some researchers think the carved animals represent totem symbols for different clans or tribes, and the stone circles were neutral meeting grounds where groups could gather without triggering territorial conflicts. Others point to the possible astronomical alignments. Some of the stone circles seem oriented towards specific solar or stellar events. Maybe Göbekli Tepe was a prehistoric calendar, a place where people marked the seasons and tracked celestial cycles important for predicting animal migrations or plant harvests. And then there's the mystery of its end. Around 8000 BC, after more than 1,500 years of use, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Not destroyed, not abandoned, buried. The builders filled in the stone circles with thousands of tons of rubble and soil, carefully covering the pillars and preserving them almost perfectly. This wasn't accidental. It was intentional, methodical, probably ritualistic. Why? We don't know. Was the site considered too sacred to leave exposed? Did the belief system that created it transform into something else? Did the emerging agricultural societies that were replacing the old hunter-gatherer cultures view the monument as a relic of a dying world? The deliberate burial at least explains why Göbekli Tepe survived when so many other sites from this period have vanished. Protected under layers of earth, the carvings remained pristine for 10,000 years, waiting for a curious German archaeologist to uncover them. But here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. Ground-penetrating radar suggests that what's been excavated so far, maybe 5% of the total site, is just the beginning. There are at least 20 additional stone circles still buried beneath Potbelly Hill, waiting to be uncovered. Each one might contain new carvings, new clues, new revelations about what our ancestors were capable of 12,000 years ago. And if Göbekli Tepe exists, if hunter-gatherers in southeastern Turkey were building massive stone monuments in 9600 BC, what else is out there? What other sites remain undiscovered, buried under millennia of sediment, hidden in regions that haven't been systematically surveyed? The answer, it turns out, is that Göbekli Tepe wasn't alone. It wasn't even unique. It was part of something much bigger. Göbekli Tepe wasn't alone. That's the part that should terrify and excite you in equal measure. For decades after its discovery, archaeologists treated it as an anomaly, a bizarre outlier. One crazy group of Stone Age people who decided to build a temple complex for reasons nobody could quite explain, then went back to hunting and gathering like nothing happened. Problem solved. Anomaly explained. Move on. Except they kept digging, and they kept finding more sites. Not just near Göbekli Tepe, but scattered across the entire Fertile Crescent. Each one pushing the timeline back further. Each one revealing capabilities that Stone Age people weren't supposed to have. In 1997, just 2 years after Göbekli Tepe's excavation began, archaeologists started work on another site about 35 kilometers to the east. They called it Karahan Tepe. And if Göbekli Tepe was strange, Karahan Tepe was stranger. Same T-shaped pillars, same massive stone construction, same evidence of complex organization and symbolic thinking. But Karahan Tepe had features that Göbekli Tepe lacked. The most striking, carved chambers hollowed directly into the bedrock. Whoever built this place didn't just pile stones on top of the ground. They carved downward, creating underground ritual spaces with the same T-shaped pillars integrated into the living rock. Think about what that means. These weren't people putting up temporary structures they could abandon when resources ran out. They were literally reshaping the landscape, committing to a place in a way that suggests permanence, planning, and a level of social organization that shouldn't exist 11,000 years ago. And the carvings. At Karahan Tepe, the iconography becomes even more explicit. Human figures with exaggerated features, serpents coiling around pillars, and everywhere the same mysterious symbolism that appears at Göbekli Tepe. These sites were connected, part of a shared cultural system that spanned hundreds of square kilometers. But it gets deeper. Because once archaeologists knew what to look for, they started recognizing similar structures across the entire region, not dozens of sites, not hundreds. Current surveys suggest there might be thousands of these megalithic sites scattered across southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, most still unexcavated, most still buried under millennia of sediment. We're not talking about a single anomalous temple complex anymore. We're talking about a civilization, a culture that existed for thousands of years, built sophisticated monuments, developed complex religious or social systems, and did it all before farming was supposed to have made any of this possible. Now, jump forward a few thousand years. Around 7,500 BC, something remarkable appears in central Anatolia, a settlement called Çatalhöyük, and this place looks like a city. 9,000 people living in mud brick houses so tightly packed together there were no streets. None. You entered your house through a hole in the roof. You walked across your neighbor's rooftops to get anywhere. The whole settlement was essentially one massive interconnected structure covering 13 hectares. The first excavators in the 1960s thought they'd found evidence of some kind of proto-urban experiment, a failed attempt at city living by people who didn't quite know what they were doing. But the more they dug, the weirder it got. The houses at Çatalhöyük were elaborately decorated. Not just simple paintings, but complex murals covering entire walls. Geometric patterns that required planning and skill to execute. Hunting scenes showing dozens of human figures pursuing wild cattle. And bulls. Bulls everywhere. Bull horns mounted on walls. Bull skulls buried beneath floors. Stylized bull heads modeled in plaster and painted in bright colors. This wasn't random decoration. This was systematic iconography. A symbolic language that every resident would have understood. The same symbolic language, by the way, that shows up at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. The bull motif appears at all three sites, suggesting cultural continuity across thousands of years and hundreds of kilometers. But here's what really challenges everything we thought we knew about early human societies. The houses at Çatalhöyük show no evidence of hierarchy, no elite residences, no palace, no temple separate from ordinary life. Every house was basically the same size. Every family had access to the same resources. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes, and genetic analysis shows no correlation between burial location and social status. This was a complex, organized society of thousands of people who somehow maintained equality for over 1,000 years. They had no kings, no priests, no warrior class, yet they built and maintained a settlement that required extraordinary levels of cooperation and planning. How? How do you get 9,000 people to live that closely together without developing hierarchies, without warfare, without the social structures that supposedly emerge inevitably when human populations reach a certain density? Nobody knows. But Çatalhöyük proves it's possible. Now, go back even further. Between 15,000 and 11,500 years ago, the Natufian culture emerged in the Levant. These people were doing things that weren't supposed to happen for thousands more years. They were building permanent settlements, not seasonal camps. Permanent year-round villages with stone foundations and substantial structures. They weren't farmers yet. That's what makes this so important. The Natufians were still hunter-gatherers, but they'd figured out how to stay in one place. They were harvesting wild cereals so systematically that they developed the first sickles, stone blades set into wooden or bone handles specifically designed for cutting grain. They were storing food in plastered pits. They were beginning the long, slow process of manipulating their environment in ways that would eventually lead to full agriculture. And they were burying their dead with a level of care and ritual that suggests complex beliefs about death, ancestry, and the afterlife. Natufian graves contain elaborate grave goods, shells brought from the Mediterranean coast, stone tools and weapons, bodies positioned carefully, sometimes with heads removed and buried separately. Some burials show evidence of feasting, suggesting communal rituals involving dozens or hundreds of people. This isn't simple survival anymore. This is culture. This is a society complex enough to have developed shared beliefs, ritual practices, and social obligations that extended beyond immediate family groups. Then there's Jericho. Around 9000 BC, someone built a stone tower there, not a small tower. A massive structure nearly 9 meters tall and 9 meters in diameter at the base. It required moving and shaping hundreds of tons of stone. It had an internal staircase of 22 steps, and it was surrounded by a stone wall that enclosed the entire settlement. The first archaeologists who found it assumed it was defensive, a fortification against enemies. But there's a problem with that interpretation. The wall at Jericho isn't really positioned to keep people out. The tower is inside the wall, not on top of it where it would be useful for defense. And the whole structure is oriented toward the nearby mountains in a way that suggests astronomical or ritual significance rather than military necessity. Maybe it wasn't about defense. Maybe it was about something else entirely. A monument, a statement, a way of organizing community labor around a shared goal that had more to do with identity and ritual than with practical defense. We don't know, but we know it was there, 11,000 years ago, built by people who supposedly weren't capable of this kind of organized construction. And here's the thing, these sites aren't isolated curiosities. They're connected. Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Çatalhöyük, the Natufian settlements, Jericho, they're all part of the same story. A web of increasingly sophisticated cultures that emerged across the Fertile Crescent between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago. They shared symbolic systems. They traded raw materials across hundreds of kilometers. They developed similar architectural styles and ritual practices. They were in contact, exchanging ideas and technologies in ways that accelerated cultural evolution across the entire region. This wasn't the birth of civilization. This was civilization already in full swing, thousands of years before Sumer, before Egypt, before any of the cultures we were taught represented humanity's first attempts at complex society. And the really unsettling part, we've barely scratched the surface. Most of these sites are less than 5% excavated. Hundreds more remain completely unexplored, visible only as subtle mounds in satellite imagery. What else is buried out there? What other evidence of sophisticated pre-Sumerian cultures is still waiting beneath millennia of soil and sand? The picture that's emerging is clear. By 10,000 BC, maybe earlier, humans across the Fertile Crescent had developed complex societies with sophisticated architecture, symbolic art, long-distance trade networks, and social organization that rivals anything that came after. But if all this was happening 12,000 years ago, what was happening even earlier? What were humans capable of during the Ice Age, when conditions were far harsher and the challenges far greater? That's where things get really interesting. Let's go backward. Forget Göbekli Tepe for a moment. Forget agriculture and permanent settlements. We need to talk about what came before. Because if we're asking how old human civilization really is, we can't just look at stone temples and pottery. We need to look at what humans were actually capable of during the Ice Age itself. And what we find there changes everything. 26,500 years ago, the world entered what geologists call the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered most of Canada, northern Europe, and significant portions of Asia. Sea levels dropped 400 feet because so much water was locked up in glaciers. Britain wasn't an island. You could walk from France to England across dry land. Indonesia and mainland Asia were connected. The coastlines we know today simply didn't exist. This wasn't a world that looked friendly to complex human culture. Average global temperatures were 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit colder than today. In some regions, winter temperatures dropped to -40 or worse. Vast stretches of what are now fertile farmland were frozen tundra. The habitable zones were compressed into narrow bands around the equator and scattered refuges where geography created microclimates capable of supporting life. Standard textbook history would have you believe that humans during this period were living in caves, barely surviving, spending all their time hunting and gathering just to stay alive. Primitive people with primitive capabilities, waiting for the ice to melt so they could invent civilization. But that's not what the archaeology shows, not even close. In September 1940, 4 teenagers and a dog went exploring in the hills above Montignac in southwestern France. They found a hole. Being teenagers, they climbed down. What they discovered was Lascaux. Chamber after chamber of painted walls. Bulls, horses, deer, and aurochs rendered in ochre and charcoal with such skill that modern artists still struggle to understand how they were created. The paintings weren't crude stick figures, they were masterpieces. The artists understood perspective, used the natural contours of the cave walls to create three-dimensional effects, and mixed pigments with a sophistication that suggests knowledge of chemistry and optics. Here's what makes your brain hurt. Those paintings are at least 17,000 years old. Some researchers think they might be older. They were created during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered half of Europe, and humans supposedly had no time for anything except survival. And Lascaux isn't alone. Chauvet Cave in southern France contains paintings that radiocarbon dating puts at 30,000 to 32,000 years old. 32,000 years. Think about that. These aren't simple doodles. They show horses, lions, rhinoceros, and mammoths rendered with such anatomical accuracy that you can identify specific species. The artists understood animal behavior, depicting hunting scenes and social interactions with ethnographic precision. Altamira in Spain. Cosca Cave, partially submerged now because of sea level rise. Dozens, maybe hundreds of painted caves across Europe, all created during the Ice Age by people who supposedly lacked the mental capacity for symbolic thinking. Except they clearly didn't lack anything. The paintings show evidence of planned composition, repeated motifs, possibly even astronomical significance. Some researchers have identified patterns in the paintings that might represent lunar calendars or seasonal markers. The placement of certain images might correspond to solstices or equinoxes. We can't prove this definitively, but the possibility alone should make us rethink what Ice Age humans were capable of. And it's not just cave paintings. Starting around 35,000 years ago, small carved figurines begin appearing in archaeological sites across Europe and Asia. The Venus figurines. You've probably seen them. Female forms carved from stone, ivory, or bone, often with exaggerated features, breasts and hips emphasized, faces usually abstracted or absent. More than 200 of these figurines have been found, from Spain to Siberia. That's a geographic range of over 3,000 miles, and they're remarkably similar in style and execution. This isn't coincidence. This is evidence of a shared artistic tradition, of cultural exchange across vast distances, of communication networks that spanned entire continents. Think about what this means. These weren't isolated bands of survivors huddled around fires. These were people who traveled, who traded, who shared ideas and artistic styles across thousands of miles during the Ice Age. When conventional history says long-distance contact was impossible, the tool technology from this period tells the same story. Upper Paleolithic humans weren't making crude stone choppers. They were manufacturing sophisticated composite tools, spear points with carefully shaped stone tips hafted onto wooden shafts with pitch and sinew. Atlatls, spear throwers that used leverage to increase throwing distance and force. Bone needles for sewing fitted clothing. Fishhooks, harpoons with detachable heads. Nets weighted with carefully worked stone sinkers. This is engineering. This is systematic problem solving and knowledge transmission across generations. You don't just wake up one morning and invent a fishhook. You need to understand materials, stress points, design principles. You need to be able to teach these skills to your children so the knowledge doesn't die with you. And the trade networks. Archaeological analysis of stone tools shows that raw materials were moving hundreds of miles from their sources. Obsidian from specific volcanic deposits in Turkey shows up in sites 500 miles away. Seashells from the Mediterranean appear in archaeological contexts deep in Central Europe. Amber from the Baltic reaches sites in southern France. This isn't casual trade. This is systematic exchange, probably involving intermediary groups, definitely requiring social structures complex enough to maintain relationships across multiple generations. You need trust. You need reciprocity. You need the ability to remember who owes what to whom, to maintain relationships with people you might only see once every few years. You need, in other words, exactly the kind of complex social organization we associate with civilization. But let's go even further back, because the evidence of sophisticated human behavior doesn't start at the last glacial maximum. It goes much, much older. 65,000 years ago, humans reached Australia. Let that sink in. Australia was never connected to mainland Asia, even during the lowest sea level stands of the Ice Age. To reach it required crossing at least 50 miles of open ocean. You can't accidentally drift to Australia. You need boats. You need navigation skills. You need the ability to provision an expedition with enough food and water to survive days at sea with no land in sight. This is 55,000 years before Sumer, before agriculture, before pottery or permanent settlements. And humans were building boats sophisticated enough for open ocean voyaging. The same thing happened in the Pacific, island hopping across Indonesia, reaching New Guinea and eventually the Solomon Islands. Each jump requiring increasingly sophisticated maritime technology. By 30,000 years ago, humans had colonized islands that required multi-day voyages out of sight of land. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing catastrophe. These were explorers. People confident enough in their technology and skills to deliberately set out for horizons they couldn't see. That takes planning. That takes accumulated knowledge. That takes culture. So when did modern human behavior really emerge? Archaeologists used to talk about a creative explosion around 40,000 years ago, when art and sophisticated tools suddenly appear in the archaeological record. But that model is collapsing. Every year, new discoveries push the timeline back. Evidence of pigment processing 100,000 years ago, engraved ochre pieces from Blombo's cave in South Africa, dated to 75,000 years. Shell beads from North Africa, 82,000 years old. The cognitive revolution wasn't a sudden event. It was a gradual accumulation of capabilities, probably beginning long before the Ice Age, refined and elaborated by populations who had hundreds of thousands of years to develop sophisticated cultural traditions. By the time the ice sheets finally began retreating around 19,000 years ago, humans weren't primitive survivors waiting to invent civilization. They were already civilized. They had art, trade networks, seafaring technology, complex social structures, and accumulated knowledge passed down across countless generations. They were ready for what came next. Ready for the discoveries that would be made when the ice finally melted and revealed landscapes that had been buried for 100,000 years. Ready to build something permanent. Now zoom out. Take everything we've been talking about. Small bands, emerging networks, early symbolic thinking. And imagine where those people would actually want to live when the Ice Age started softening its grip. Not on some freezing plateau miles from anything useful. On the coast. Shorelines are cheat codes for survival. You get all the good stuff at once. Stable temperatures compared to the interior. Predictable tides. Rivers meeting the sea, concentrating nutrients. Shellfish you can gather without sophisticated tools. Fish runs that happen year after year. Seabirds, eggs, seals, maybe even stranded whales if you're lucky. And on top of that, the coastline itself becomes a highway. You can walk, paddle, or sail along it, keeping land in sight, following the same route generation after generation. If you're a clever Ice Age human trying to build reliable food strategies, trade routes, maybe even early ritual centers, the coasts are where you go. There's just one problem. We've lost almost all of them. During the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, the world looked very different. Massive ice sheets locked up so much water that global sea levels were more than 120 meters, almost 400 feet lower than they are today. That doesn't just mean a bit more beach. It means entire continents had different shapes. Huge shelves of land extended miles out from our current shorelines. Island chains were connected. Narrow straits disappeared. What's now shallow seafloor was once dry land, valleys, plains, river deltas. In other words, if you drew a map of prime real estate for Ice Age humans, enormous chunks of it are now under the ocean. Think about what that means for archaeology. Every time you see a map of ancient sites, you're seeing only the part of the world that happens to still be above water. It's like trying to reconstruct a movie when 3/4 of the frames have been burned. We know humans loved coasts whenever they could get to them. Some of the earliest firmly dated seafaring in the world comes from places like Wallacea, those islands between Asia and Australia. People were crossing deep water there more than 40,000 years ago. On South Africa's southern shore, sites like Pinnacle Point show humans systematically harvesting shellfish, using complex tools, and maybe even painting with ochre more than 100,000 years ago. If they were doing that on the surviving scraps of coast we can still dig, what was happening on the continental shelves that are now 50, 80, 100 meters underwater? We don't have to guess completely blind. The ocean has already coughed up some hints. In the North Sea, there used to be a world called Doggerland. Today, anglers drag their nets across a shallow, murky seafloor between Britain and mainland Europe. But 10,000 years ago, that wasn't seafloor. It was a vast lowland of rivers, lakes, forests, and wetlands stretching from what's now eastern England to Denmark and the Netherlands. We only discovered it because of accident and persistence. Fishermen kept hauling up ancient bones and stone tools with their catch. Mammoth, elk, human-made artifacts. Then geologists mapped the submerged landscape with seismic data. What emerged was astonishing. Not just a drowned coastline, but an entire lost country. Hill ridges, river valleys, floodplains. Places where people clearly lived, hunted, and probably traveled between what later became islands. And Doggerland is just one region where we've pulled the veil back a little. Off the west coast of India, in the Gulf of Combat, sonar surveys have revealed what some researchers interpret as geometric patterns on the seafloor. Straight lines, right angles, possible foundations. The claims here are controversial. Dating is difficult, and alternative explanations like natural formations or later disturbance are always on the table. But pottery shards and artifacts have been dredged up from the area. Some claim to be more than 9,000 years old. Whether that specific site turns out to be a true proto-city or not, we already know India's coasts preserve drowned archaeological material. Further south at sites like Pumpuhar, offshore structures align with the idea of ancient settlements lost to rising seas during the Holocene. Then there's Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan. Divers there discovered a stepped, terraced formation that looks at first glance almost like a submerged ziggurat or pyramid. Flat platforms, straight edges, staircase-like features dropping into deep blue water. Some geologists argue it's entirely natural, sandstone fractured and eroded along bedding planes. Others, including a few archaeologists, think human modification might be involved. Carved steps, smoothed surfaces, maybe even toppled pillars. The jury's still out. Yonaguni might be nature wearing a mask that looks suspiciously like architecture. Or it might be a genuine structure heavily modified by millennia of marine erosion. But either way, it raises an important point. Our picture of the ancient world is biased toward what's convenient to dig. Dry land, shallow caves, river terraces we can trench with a backhoe. The seafloor is hard, expensive, and dangerous to explore, so we've barely touched it. This is where the statistical argument hits. If you're imagining the Ice Age world correctly, you have to imagine not just the continents we see today, but the full apron of land that wrapped around them at lower sea levels. Estimates vary, but when the ice sheets melted and the seas rose that 120 plus meters, millions of square kilometers of coastal plain went under. River mouths where early villages might have formed. Bays where seasonal camps gathered for fish runs. Cliffs and headlands that could have hosted ritual sites, signal fires, or lookout posts. How much of that lost terrain have we systematically surveyed with modern archaeological methods? A tiny fraction, far less than we've combed on land. It's like having a puzzle where 30% of the pieces are visible on the table, 70% slid under the couch, and then declaring you're confident you understand the full picture printed on the box. So when people ask if there were earlier complex societies before Sumer, where are the ruins? Part of the answer might be brutally simple. A lot of the best places to build anything. A harbor, a trading camp, a permanent settlement, are now under tens of meters of water, buried under silt and sand. Now, this is where we have to be careful. It's tempting to jump from "we've lost a lot of coastline" to "there must have been global, Ice Age empires with skyscrapers and satellites." That leap isn't supported by evidence. Nothing we've found so far suggests high technology or anything remotely like modern industrial civilization during the late Ice Age. But that doesn't mean there couldn't have been communities more complex, more permanent, and more architecturally ambitious than what we currently see on surviving inland sites. Think of Göbekli Tepe again. Massive stone enclosures, symbolic animal carvings, organized labor, all built by people who, as far as we can tell, were still foragers. If something like that could be built 11,600 years ago on a rocky hilltop in Anatolia, what might have been built 5,000 years earlier on a fertile, resource-rich coastal plain, now 60 meters underwater? We don't know, and that we don't know is the point. Mainstream archaeology is starting to grapple with this. For a long time, underwater archaeology meant shipwrecks, Roman cargo boats, Viking longships, 18th century warships. Those are easier to find and date, and they tell amazing stories. But only recently has marine archaeology turned seriously to prehistory, to mapping drowned river channels, scanning continental shelves, sampling buried shorelines. New technologies are helping. High-resolution multi-beam sonar can paint detailed 3D images of the seafloor. Sub-bottom profilers can see through layers of sediment to buried landscapes. Autonomous underwater vehicles can follow pre-programmed grids, quietly scanning where no diver could stay long enough to work. The first results are already rewriting local histories. Submerged Neolithic camps in the North Sea, ancient forests off the British coast, submerged stone tools off Australia showing that Aboriginal people once lived on land far beyond today's shoreline. Each discovery is like a postcard from a world we forgot existed. What we don't have yet is the Ice Age equivalent of a city wall, a harbour installation, or a Göbekli Tepe, scale ritual complex lying in 80 meters of water. Maybe those structures never existed. Maybe they were mostly wood and earth, erased by waves and time. Or maybe they're still out there, waiting in some unexplored bay of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, or off the shores of Southeast Asia. For now, the submerged evidence hypothesis isn't a license to believe anything you want about lost civilizations. It's a reminder of something more uncomfortable and more interesting. Our current timeline of civilization is built on the thin, exposed skin of the Earth that happened not to drown when the ice melted. The rest, the best coastal territories of the Ice Age world, are behind a curtain of salt water and darkness. We're only just beginning to pull that curtain back. Now, once you start talking about advanced humans before Sumer, you walk straight into a minefield. On one side, you've got academic archaeologists with radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy, and career reputations on the line. On the other, you've got best-selling authors, Netflix documentaries, and YouTube channels arguing for lost civilizations, global cataclysms, and ancient high technology. Somebody's wrong, but it's not always obvious who or by how much. Let's start with the name that inevitably shows up in this conversation, Graham Hancock. Hancock has been arguing for decades that there was a sophisticated global civilization before the end of the last ice age. Not spaceships and laser beams advanced, but advanced enough to map coastlines, align monuments with stars, maybe even build in stone at a scale we usually associate with Bronze Age kingdoms. In his view, places like Göbekli Tepe, mysterious megalithic sites, and global flood myths are fingerprints of this forgotten culture. According to this picture, around the end of the Ice Age, something catastrophic happens. Sea levels rise, climates flip, cities on now submerged coasts vanish, and the survivors become the civilizing heroes of later myths, culture bringers, gods, sage kings teaching agriculture, astronomy, and architecture to shell-shocked hunter-gatherers. It's a compelling story. It feels satisfying. It explains gaps, coincidences, weird outliers in the archaeological record. It gives us drama, a rise, a fall, a memory echoing across mythologies. But the criticisms are serious. Mainstream archaeologists don't just object to Hancock's tone or his attitude toward academia. They point to the basic issue, evidence. If there was an Ice Age civilization sophisticated enough to build cities, temples, and observatories all over the world, where are the unambiguous remains? Not a few enigmatic stones, not one or two possible harbors, but the huge, messy footprint real complex societies always leave. Massive garbage pits, dense settlement layers, metallurgy debris, written records or proto-writing systems, clear technological sequences. When we look at Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, we're buried in this kind of evidence. With Ice Age Atlantis, we're mostly not. Some alignments can be explained by chance or by simple practical needs. Some recurring myths can be explained by shared human experiences, floods, comets, hunger, fear of the sky. Critics argue that Hancock takes genuine anomalies and builds a whole civilization on top of them, often ignoring simpler explanations. Then there's Randall Carlson and the Younger Dryas impact theory. Carlson, along with a group of geologists and researchers, argues that around 10,800 BC, Earth was hit by fragments of a disintegrating comet. Not a single neat Hollywood asteroid, but a shotgun blast of impacts and airbursts across the northern hemisphere. This, they say, triggered the Younger Dryas, that sudden return to near-glacial conditions just when the planet was warming. In this scenario, ice sheets melt catastrophically, megafloods tear across continents, wildfires rage, and any coastal or riverine cultures, more complex than we currently imagine, get wiped off the map. In Carlson's version, this isn't just a climate blip, it's a reset button. a global trauma that erases most traces of a prior high culture, leaving behind scattered stories, megaliths, and survivors who slowly rebuild. Here, the debate gets even trickier, because unlike an Ice Age Atlantis with zero physical proof, the Younger Dryas event is real. There really was a sharp, sudden cooling. Something really did push the climate system back toward Ice Age conditions for more than 1,000 years. The question is, what caused it? The impact hypothesis is one attempt at an answer. Over the years, its proponents have pointed to possible impact proxies: microscopic spherules, peaks in platinum, layers of soot, unusual melt glass that might form in high-temperature events. Some studies seem supportive. Others don't replicate the findings or offer more mundane explanations. Wildfires, volcanism, normal geological processes that can look weird if you cherry-pick your samples. So mainstream science isn't rejecting the idea of dramatic climate change. That's accepted. It's rejecting the comet explanation as not yet proven, and the leap from possible impacts to global civilization erased as enormous. Which raises the bigger question: why does mainstream archaeology push back so hard on these ideas? Part of it is simple caution. Archaeology is, at its core, a slow science. Tiny fragments of bone, shards of pottery, layers of sediment, radiocarbon dates that need careful calibration. You change your mind when the evidence forces you, not when a narrative feels neat. Extraordinary claims. A whole missing chapter of human civilization, a planetary reset that wiped it clean. Need extraordinary, repeatable, overwhelming evidence. Part of it is method. Archaeologists work from the ground up, from the trench, from the lab, from the stratigraphy. Fringe theories often work from the top down. Start with a big story, then go looking for suggestive details to support it. That reversal of direction makes scientists nervous because it's a perfect recipe for confirmation bias. You can always find a myth, a rock alignment, a flood layer that sort of matches what you already want to believe. And part of it, if we're honest, is human. Careers, funding, reputations, the inertia of established models. Paradigm shifts are uncomfortable. Nobody wants to admit they've spent 30 years missing something huge sitting right under their nose. But here's the twist. Sometimes, the so-called fringe does get vindicated. Göbekli Tepe is the obvious example. Before its excavation, the standard story went like this. First agriculture, then villages, then towns, then temples. You get organized religion and monumental architecture after you have settled farming communities to fund and feed the builders. Then Göbekli Tepe shows up and casually nukes that timeline. You've got hunter-gatherers, pre-pottery, with no clear evidence of full-scale agriculture, carving multi-ton T-shaped pillars, organizing labor crews, and building the oldest known monumental ritual site on Earth. When this idea was first floated, that pre-Neolithic foragers could pull this off. It sounded fringe. It sounded like someone had watched too many documentaries and wanted to rewrite the rulebook. Now, it's in the textbooks. Not because someone shouted loudly enough, but because the evidence was undeniable. Stratified layers, consistent radiocarbon dates, thousands of artifacts all locked in context. The site forced archaeology to accept a new possibility. Complex symbolic culture and organized labor can come before, and maybe even help drive, the invention of agriculture. So the line between fringe and frontier is not fixed. It moves when the data moves it. That's the space we have to live in when we talk about lost civilizations and cosmic cataclysms. Total denial. The current model is complete, nothing major will change, is a kind of dogma, but uncritical acceptance. If it's dramatic and contrarian, it must be true, is just pseudoscience in a shiny costume. The only way through is an open but ruthless mind. If there really was a sophisticated Ice Age society, we should expect to find more than speculation. Systematic evidence, multiple independent lines converging. Underwater surveys, submerged coastlines mapped and sampled, clear stratified ruins, consistent radiocarbon profiles. If the Younger Dryas impact really triggered a planetary disaster, the signatures should show up the same way we see the dinosaur-killing asteroid. Clear global markers, replicated across labs, surviving skeptical attacks. Until then, These ideas live in a liminal space, not completely impossible, not proven, hovering at the edge of what the evidence can support. The danger is that both sides can drift into extremes. On one side, a rigid orthodoxy that reflexively dismisses new data because it doesn't fit. On the other, a seductive mythology that treats speculation as fact and uses any anomaly as proof of everything. If we want to understand what really happened before Sumer, we can't afford either. We need archaeologists willing to drag sonar across drowned continental shelves, geologists willing to re-examine impact proxies, and yes, popularizers willing to ask uncomfortable questions, but also to accept uncomfortable answers when the data doesn't cooperate. Because the deep past doesn't care what story we prefer, it only cares what actually happened. And to get closer to that, we need to look hard at one of the biggest suspects in this whole debate, the Younger Dryas itself. Did something around 10,800 BC slam the reset button on human progress? Or are we projecting drama onto a climate curve we barely understand? To answer that, we have to zoom out again. From stone circles and speculative cities, to a planet lurching in and out of ice. Now jump forward. It's around 10,800 BC. Your ancestors are living in a world that finally seems to be calming down. The last glacial maximum is fading. Ice sheets are retreating. Temperatures are rising. In the Near East, wild wheat and barley are thick on the hillsides. In Anatolia, hunter-gatherers are experimenting with semi-permanent camps. Along coasts and rivers, people have mapped every fishing ground, every migration route, every seasonal plant. For thousands of years, the trend has been the same: warmer, wetter, more predictable. And humans, as always, have been taking advantage of it. Then, almost overnight, the planet slams on the brakes. This is the Younger Dryas. From about 10,800 to 9,700 BC, global climate plunges back into near-glacial conditions. In Greenland ice cores, you can see it as a cliff. 1 decade, temperatures are rising. A few decades later, they've dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in some regions. Not a slow drift, a snap. In the Levant, where people had been building the Natufian culture, stone houses, cemeteries, elaborate microlith tools, the environment turns harsher and drier. Wild cereals that had supported large, semi-settled communities fail. In Europe, forest retreat and steppe returns. In North America, ecosystems are thrown into chaos. For more than 1,000 years, the climate yo-yos between brutal cold and unstable warmth. Rainfall patterns shift, glaciers advance again. Rivers change course. Species that had been recovering after the Ice Age suddenly find themselves in a new disaster movie, including us. So what happened? The conservative explanation is simple: complex feedbacks in the climate system. Melting ice sheets dump freshwater into the North Atlantic, shutting down ocean circulation and plunging the Northern Hemisphere back into a deep chill. No aliens, no doomsday rock from space, just physics. But in the last 2 decades, another idea has been forcing archaeologists and geologists to pay attention. A cosmic impact, not a dinosaur killer on the scale of Chicxulub, more like a swarm of medium-sized objects. Comets or fragments of a disintegrating body, slamming into the ice sheets and atmosphere. Why even consider this? Because scattered across sites from North America to Europe to the Middle East, researchers keep finding the same strange fingerprints right at the Younger Dryas boundary. A paper-thin black layer in the soil, loaded with microscopic spherules formed at extremely high temperatures. Glass-like materials called melt glass that seem to have required temperatures hotter than most wildfires can produce. And nanodiamonds, tiny crystals that form under intense heat and pressure, the kind you'd expect from impacts or airbursts. At some sites, there are peaks of platinum and iridium, elements associated with meteorites. At others, charcoal spikes suggest continent-scale wildfires. Layer after layer of normal sediment. Then this razor-thin horizon of weirdness. Then a world that looks different. Right on cue, megafauna begin to vanish. In North America, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears. Species that had survived multiple glacial cycles. disappear within a few centuries of the onset of the Younger Dryas. Similar extinctions hit parts of Europe and the Middle East. Climate change alone can do a lot. Human overhunting can do a lot. But some researchers argue that the pattern and timing fit better with a sudden catastrophic event layered on top of those pressures. Is the cosmic impact hypothesis proven? No. It's controversial, heavily debated, and some claim signatures have turned out to be less clear than first thought. But the Younger Dryas boundary layer is real, and whatever caused it, the world that came after was not the same as the world before. So what did this mean for humans? Imagine you're part of a community in the Natufian heartland around 11,000 BC. Your grandparents remember a world that seemed to be getting easier. Large, stable settlements, stone architecture, intensive harvesting of wild grains, maybe even the first tentative experiments with tending favored plants. You live in a culture that knows exactly when certain foods are in season, how to exploit multiple ecological zones, how to store surplus. You're not civilized in the later sense. No writing, no cities. But compared to Ice Age foragers, your world looks almost Proto-Neolithic. Then the climate flips. Harvests fail unpredictably. Game moves into new territories. Droughts bite. Or in other regions, floods rip through valleys as glacial lakes overtop and empty in catastrophic pulses. What happens to knowledge in that kind of world? Complex ecological know-how is only useful if the ecology stays roughly the same. Detailed maps of river fisheries, subtle timing of when to exploit a marsh, specialized tools adapted to a certain animal. All of that can become obsolete in a decade if the animals migrate, the river changes course, the marsh dries up, populations shrink, groups fragment. Some regions are simply abandoned. Others see waves of migrants competing for increasingly unreliable resources. Under those conditions, what survives is not necessarily the highest level of technological complexity, but whatever is most portable, most adaptable, and easiest to teach in a crisis. You get population bottlenecks, not to the extreme 1,280-person level of 800,000 years ago, but local collapses. Chains of cultural transmission snap. Elders die before they can pass everything on. Ritual specialists, skilled artisans, navigators, herbalists, entire professions vanish with the communities that supported them. Thousands of years of accumulated place-specific knowledge can evaporate in a few brutal generations. If there had been pockets of surprisingly sophisticated Ice Age culture, coastal traders, early monument builders, groups experimenting with managed landscapes, the Younger Dryas is exactly the kind of event that could erase most of their traces. This might help explain one of the strangest features of the archaeological record. On one side of the Younger Dryas, we see late Ice Age ingenuity, complex stone tool traditions, possible early architecture, hints of social stratification, people shaping entire ecosystems with fire. On the other side, right after 9,700 BC, when the Younger Dryas finally ends, we see what looks like a sudden flowering, Göbekli Tepe, rapid development of farming in the Fertile Crescent, an explosion of permanent settlements and monumental architecture over just a few thousand years. To some researchers, it looks like a gap, a missing bridge between late Pleistocene sophistication and early Neolithic civilization, as if something interrupted the trajectory, wiped the slate halfway clean, and forced a reboot, a second beginning. And here's where myth creeps in. We tend to treat flood stories as moral tales or pure fantasy, but step back and look at them globally. Myths of great floods, fire from the sky, darkness at noon, a time when the world was destroyed and remade. They appear in Mesopotamia, India, the Americas, Australia, the Pacific, Europe. They aren't all the same, and they weren't all born at the same time. But many involve a few common elements: a long-established world, a sudden, overwhelming catastrophe often linked to water, fire, or falling stars, mass death, a small number of survivors who remember the old ways and pass them on into a new age. Now imagine your ancestors living through the Younger Dryas in a coastal settlement. The sea rises and falls as ice sheets grow and melt. Storms intensify. Maybe a fragment from space explodes in the atmosphere, lighting the sky and triggering fires. Rivers surge. Low-lying plains flood. You don't write this down. You tell it, over and over for centuries. Every generation adds details, loses others, edits the story to fit new realities. By the time someone carves it into clay in Sumer or recites it to a Greek poet, the original event is buried under theology and metaphor. But the emotional core, once the world we knew ended, remains. If the Younger Dryas was a global trauma, it would make sense that fragments of it echo in myths from cultures that emerged long after. Not as eyewitness reports, but as distorted memories of a time when climate and catastrophe forced humans to start over. For archaeologists, this raises a troubling question. When we look at the Neolithic revolution after 9700 BC, the rapid rise of agriculture, the sudden appearance of massive ritual sites like Göbekli Tepe, are we seeing the first time humans built complex societies, or are we seeing the first time they rebuilt them after an almost forgotten catastrophe? If the Younger Dryas did act as a partial reset button on human progress, then what we call the birth of civilization might actually be a second chapter. The first chapter, written on Ice Age coasts and river plains now drowned or eroded, would be mostly gone. That doesn't mean lost super cities or laser beams. It could be something quieter but still revolutionary. Sophisticated trade networks, proto-farming, organized ritual centers, complex oral law codes, achievements impressive enough that, when the world stabilized again, descendants tried to recreate them. The end of the Younger Dryas around 9700 BC doesn't just mark a temperature change in an ice core. It might mark the point where, after more than 1,000 years of chaos, human societies finally got a stable enough world to scale up again. A second chance. And if that's true, then everything that happens next, Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, Çatalhöyük, Sumer, needs to be reread, not as the beginning of the story, but as the comeback. So how does any of this help us answer the question, how old is civilization really? To see that, we have to look at the tools that are quietly rewriting the timeline from underneath the textbooks. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists were flying half-blind. They had shovels, trowels, and a rough sense of time. You found a pot, you compared it to other pots, you guessed a date. Maybe you got lucky and found some charcoal you could send for radiocarbon dating. But even that was blurry, big error bars, lots of assumptions. Whole chapters of human history were being written on the basis of a few smudged data points. That's not the world we live in anymore. Over the last few decades, dating technology has gone from rough sketch to high definition. Radiocarbon has been refined to the point where tiny fragments of burned seeds, a sliver of bone, even residues on stone tools can give you surprisingly precise ages. Once you calibrate them against tree rings and other natural archives, we're not just saying around 10,000 BC anymore. We're arguing about whether something is 9,600 or 9,400. And radiocarbon is only one piece of the puzzle. There's OSL, optically stimulated luminescence. It sounds like science fiction, but the concept is simple. Sand grains act like tiny time capsules. When they're buried, they start storing up energy from background radiation. When you dig them up in a dark lab and hit them with light, they release that stored energy, and you can measure how long they've been hidden from the sun. That means you can date when a layer of sediment was last exposed to daylight, when a wall collapsed, when a floor was laid, when a site was buried by a flood. Suddenly, places that had no date now have timestamps. Then there's DNA. Not just ancient DNA from skeletons, though that's powerful enough on its own, telling us who was related to whom when populations split, when they mingled again. But also environmental DNA, traces left in cave mud, lake sediments, even calcite crusts. A bit of genetic material from a plant, an animal, a human, trapped in the environment and preserved for tens of thousands of years. That lets us reconstruct ecosystems, track migrations, and see when people were present in a landscape, even if they left almost no visible artifacts. Put all of this together, and you get something the earlier generations of archaeologists could only dream of. A timeline with enough resolution to start asking very uncomfortable questions about when civilization-like behavior actually began. and the new dates are not behaving themselves. Take Morocco. For a long time, the origin story for our species was simple and neat. Modern humans appeared in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, then slowly spread. Clean diagram. Easy exam question. Then in 2017, a team working at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco dropped a bomb. They redated a set of fossils that had been known for decades, using refined thermoluminescence and other methods, and got an age of about 300,000 years. The remains looked like us, not exactly modern. Some features were archaic, but clearly on the Homo sapiens line. Alongside them, sophisticated stone tools, evidence of fire use, clear signs of a culture that wasn't just scraping by. Suddenly, our species wasn't 200,000 years old. It was at least 300,000, and it wasn't confined to one cozy cradle in East Africa. It looked more like a network spread across the continent, evolving in parallel, sharing ideas and genes over vast distances. Then look the other way across the map. Australia. For a long time, the story went like this. Humans reached Australia around 40,000 years ago. That alone is impressive. You don't casually walk to Australia. You have to cross open water. Even the old dates implied boat technology, navigation skills, and social organization strong enough to plan voyages beyond the visible shoreline. But recent work has been pushing that arrival date back. Some sites suggest humans in northern Australia 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. And it's not just footprints in the sediment. There's rock art, murals, engravings, complex symbolic designs. That hints at a fully developed visual language. Not people just surviving in a new land, but people bringing a world of stories, rituals, and beliefs with them. So by 60,000 years ago, we have Homo sapiens leaving Africa, building boats, crossing seas, adapting to deserts, jungles, and ice age coastlines, and painting intricate images on rock walls. This is not a species just waking up. This is a species that has been thinking like us for a very long time. And that's the emerging consensus from genetics, archaeology, and cognitive science. Anatomically modern humans had the brain power for modern behavior far earlier than we used to think. The neurons, the language potential, the capacity for symbolic thought, they were all in place tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years before cities ever appeared. So why did we wait so long? For decades, researchers talked about a sudden explosion of culture. Around 50,000 years ago, the story went, everything changes at once. Art, ornaments, advanced tools, long-distance trade, the human revolution. It's a clean narrative. You can draw a vertical line on a graph and say, here, this is when we became us. But as more precise dates roll in from more parts of the world, that sharp line is starting to blur. We find engraved ochre and drilled shell beads in Africa at 70,000. 100,000 years ago, we see elaborate hunting strategies long before the supposed revolution. We find hints of personal adornment, pigment use, and possible ritual behavior among Neanderthals as well as modern humans. We see rock art in Australia that implies deep mythologies carried across oceans. Instead of a single explosion, the pattern looks more like a long, slow fuse. Periods of innovation, local breakthroughs, cultural experiments that flare up, fade out, and then reappear somewhere else in a slightly different form. It's not that nothing happened for 250,000 years and then suddenly everything did. It's that we've only just started to detect the earlier sparks. So why do the textbooks still talk like civilization begins in Sumer around 3500 BC, as if someone flipped a switch and cities popped into existence out of nowhere? Partly, it's inertia. Textbooks are slow to change, university curricula even slower, and Sumer really is a threshold. Writing, formal law codes, large-scale bureaucracy, monumental architecture in baked brick. All clearly visible in the archaeological record. You can point to a tablet and say, this is a contract, this is a receipt, this is a story. That's comforting. The deeper past is not comforting. It's messy, fragmentary. It doesn't give us neat definitions. Our standardized stone tools spread over 500 miles a sign of civilization, Are megalithic enclosures like Göbekli Tepe, built 6,000 years before Sumer, temples of an unknown religion, or just very elaborate hunting lodges, when small scattered groups maintain long-distance trade networks, shared rituals, and complex mythologies? Is that civilization, or something just before it? Most archaeologists are cautious, because they have to be. The evidence is fragile. A single new date can overturn an elegant theory. Claim too much, and you become a headline today and a punchline tomorrow. But the narrative is shifting, even if slowly. We are moving away from the picture of humans stumbling in the dark until 10,000 BC, then suddenly inventing everything at once. In its place, a different image is emerging. A species with modern minds living through dramatically changing climates, repeatedly building up complex cultures, losing them, rebuilding again, thousands of years before the first cuneiform sign was pressed into wet clay. And that raises a set of questions that no one can answer yet. How many early experiments in settled life have we missed under shorelines drowned by post-Ice Age seas? How many proto-cities eroded away on floodplains that have been reworked again and again? Did groups in places we now call North Africa, South Asia, or the Sunda Shelf flirt with agriculture, monument building, and long-distance trade, only to be erased by droughts, floods, or rising oceans? Will the next decade of research uncover a clear, undeniable pre-Sumerian civilization, complete with city planning, large-scale architecture, and perhaps even a form of record-keeping? Or will it reveal something stranger? A world of multiple regional traditions, each complex in their own way, none of them quite matching our neat, textbook definition of civilization, but all of them much older than we dared to imagine. Right now, the only honest answer is, we don't know. But the tools keep getting sharper. Satellites are scanning buried landscapes. Underwater archaeology is probing drowned valleys and continental shelves. DNA labs are pulling stories out of bones once considered useless. If what we've found in the last 20 years can overturn the old timelines this dramatically, imagine what another 20 might do. And that brings us back to the question at the heart of this investigation. If humans have been us for so long, how many chapters of our story are still missing? Washed away, buried deep, or waiting, just beneath the surface, for someone to brush aside the dust and realize that civilization, in some form, began far earlier than we've ever allowed ourselves to believe. So where does all of this leave us? We started in the dusty streets of Sumer, in a world of writing, laws, and kings, the textbook beginning of civilization. Then we walked backward in time, past cuneiform tablets and ziggurats, past the neat story of first cities, back to a hillside in southeastern Turkey where, 7,000 years before Sumer, hunter-gatherers dragged multi-ton stones into circles and carved animals with a precision that still shocks archaeologists. Then we went further, into the Ice Age, into a world of glaciers and mammoths, where people with stone tools planned hunts, managed fire, processed plants, and probably told stories under cold, clear skies. Further back still, into the genetic bottleneck that almost ended us before civilization was even possible. Tiny scattered bands hanging on by their fingernails, inventing new ways to live because the old ways weren't enough. And the pattern that keeps emerging is simple and unsettling. Our ancestors were not dumb brutes waiting around for Sumer to teach them how to be civilized. They were problem solvers, engineers with wood, stone, bone, and memory, navigators without maps, social organizers without writing. People who could look at a dangerous, unstable world and somehow imagine a tomorrow. Does that mean there was a lost global civilization 20,000 years ago with satellites and skyscrapers? Probably not. The evidence just isn't there. But here's the key point. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when much of the most promising real estate for early complex societies is now under 100 meters of seawater, ground to dust by ice sheets, or buried beneath later settlements. What the archaeology and genetics actually force us to confront is more interesting than any single lost city story. They tell us that the line between foragers and civilization is blurry, that people tens of thousands of years ago were already experimenting with monument building, long-distance trade, complex rituals, maybe even proto-agriculture. That the mental hardware needed for Sumer was installed long before Sumer itself. So the honest answer to how old is human civilization really is older than we thought, and still not fully mapped. We are standing in the dark with a few flashlights, catching glimpses of something vast. That should make us cautious. It should also make us curious. If you want to be part of that curiosity, hit like so this kind of content reaches more people. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because this story belongs to all of us. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next step in this investigation into our deep past. If you'd like to go one level deeper and support the work that goes into these episodes, you can also join our membership here on YouTube. Totally optional, but it helps us spend more time digging into the evidence instead of just skimming the surface. However you choose to be involved, keep questioning, keep exploring. Because the further back we look, the more we realize the real mystery isn't whether an ancient civilization is hiding out there. The real mystery is how much of their story is still hiding inside us.